The Syrian government and numerous diverse opposition groups disagree over how the talks should be conducted. The opposition demands that President Bashar al-Assad should resign, while the official Damascus says there should be no preconditions. Joining me now, live from London, UK, is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. He's publisher and editor of Politics First. Dr. Papadopoulos, please tell me if you can hear us loud and clear.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clearly.
Wonderful. OK, now Lakhdar Brahimi will discuss Geneva II peace conference with Russian and US representatives today. Well, what can we expect from this meeting, actually? I mean, do you really think there will be a breakthrough?
At such a tentative stage in negotiations, I think it's unlikely that there will be a breakthrough today. I think what we can expect to hear from Brahimi once the meetings are over is that despite differences between the parties involved in the meetings today, despite the challenges that are posed to a peace conference, all parties are resolutely committed to a peaceful solution to Syria and to holding a conference on Syria. I think the language of diplomacy is what will be used today, but I think I think the sad reality is that a peace conference should have been held in the early stages of the violence in Syria back in 2011. Why has it taken so long? Why has it taken in excess of 100,000 deaths to bring about a peace conference? The brutal reality is that back in 2011, the West, led by the United States and its regional allies, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, saw an opportunity to remove a non-compliant government in Syria, which follows an independent foreign policy. They certainly underestimated the resolve of the Syrian government. They certainly underestimated the resolve of the Syrian armed forces, and they certainly underestimated the support that the Syrian government has within Syria. So that's why a peace conference is only being held today, or at this part of in this stage of the year.
Do you really think that this is going to? Sorry to interrupt you there. Do you really think that this is going to actually come about this year? I mean, we're running out of this year, aren't we? I mean, do you think it's going to really happen?
That really depends on the West and its regional allies in getting the militants, who make up the so-called Free Syrian Army, to the peace table. From the very start, the Syrian government has said that it will go to the conference, despite having set down its own conditions. But it has made it clear it will go. However, the Syrian National Coalition, which is foreign-based and foreign-backed, and the Free Syrian Army have made one demand after one demand after one demand. They want everything on their own terms and conditions, and that's completely unacceptable, and that shows how naive they are about politics and about diplomacy. You have to go to a peace conference with an open mind and to be prepared to compromise. But, these people that make up the SNC and the FSA, no one in Syria has ever voted for them. No one in Syria has ever put their name down on a ballot paper and put it in the ballot box. They're completely foreign-based and they're completely foreign-backed. And it's quite ironic that we hear them saying we have to have peace in Syria. It's quite ironic that we hear Western politicians and regional politicians saying we have to have peace in Syria, when it's their actions which have brought about the bloodshed in Syria. If the West and its regional allies had not provided military, logistical and political support to the militants on the ground in Syria, we wouldn't have 100,000 deaths today.
And that brings me to another question. Now, opposition leader Ahmad Jabbar said he would not participate if Iran attends. Now, Tehran is largely considered to be one of the most powerful of Assad's backers in this conflict, isn't he? So I mean, what part can Iran play in the peace negotiations then?
Well, the question I would ask, why shouldn't Iran be invited to the conference. The
Yes.
reason why
Yes, but
certain
opposition
Western
leader...
nations and regional nations are saying that, yes.
the Jabba said he won't participate. Opposition leader.
Well, the problem is that, once again, it takes me back to what I said just now. The armed opposition and the political opposition outside of Syria, they want everything on their own terms and on their own conditions. Iran geographically resides in the Middle East, and Iran is a major player in the Middle East. Therefore, it's completely acceptable and logical for it to be invited to the peace conference. You know, one could turn around and say, if Iran shouldn't be invited, why should Saudi Arabia be invited? The reality is that there are certain politicians in the West and regional politicians that don't want Iran there for political reasons.
Let's now turn to a few remarks that Lakhdar Brahimi has repeatedly said, and he said that Syria could turn into something like Somalia. You know, the longer the conflict goes on, the more refugees flee the country, the war-torn country, and a large-scale humanitarian crisis ensues. Now, I mean, how do you see this and his comments?
Well, there's the potential for that to happen. I don't think it will, because from the very start, the military initiative has lay with the Syrian Arab Army, the only legitimate, the only legal force, armed force on Syria. Certainly, late last year, the militants of the FSA, they scored numerous successes. But I think their successes have been overstated by Western politicians and Western journalists, and I don't think you're going to see any more advances from the northern parts of Syria, where the militants are based at the moment. And I do think that a peaceful solution really is the only solution and the best solution in the interests of ordinary Syrian people. However, I am concerned because Saudi Arabia, for example, Turkey, for example, is still supporting the armed groups which make up the Free Syrian Army. So as long as that keeps on going on, the more people will die in Syria, and the potential for Syria becoming a failed state is there. I don't think it will happen because of the strength of the Syrian army and because most Syrians, either actively or passively, support the Syrian government. But certainly Western governments should be very careful who they're getting into bed with in regards to the Free Syrian Army. I mean, it's a lethal cocktail of various groups, ranging from Islamists to jihadists to criminals to mercenaries. They really are quite repulsive people. I mean, they've beheaded priests, not just by cutting their heads off, but by sawing their heads off. They kill Alawite civilians, they do, in their hundreds. These are not the sort of people that the West should be cozying up to in any sense.
Now, let's look into the future, say, next year. If the conflict does not go on, it's going to take a long time to iron everything out so that the country is more or less stable. I mean, it's a long process now, isn't it? I mean, it, as you mentioned before, Doctor, it's gone too far.
This is not going to be resolved. It's certainly not going to be resolved this year. I find it difficult to believe it will be resolved in the first part of next year. I think, I mean, it takes either a brave or a foolish person to try and predict these sort of things, but I suspect that what we will see next year is continuous, albeit slow, advances by the Syrian army into those parts of Syria that are presently controlled by the militants. Simultaneously, there will be negotiations around a peace table. But at the same time, the militants in Syria, because they're on the back foot, because they know that they are losing, militarily certainly, and politically they're starting to lose support, they are going to resort to ever more suicide bombings, ever more mortaring of Syrian cities, towns, villages, aiming at civilians to install terror in the hearts of civilians in Syria. So, this sort of conflict could have been resolved a couple of years ago. It wasn't. It's gone so far now. But we mustn't be pessimistic. These sort of things can be sorted out. Peace can be brought to Syria, but it requires responsible behaviour from internal actors and external actors. The external actors, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, must stop supporting logistically and militarily the so-called Free Syrian Army. It's quite simple. And also, yes.
No, I was just going to say, and obviously you believe that Russia and US can play a key role.
Certainly. Yes, certainly. Look, Russia and America are the two most powerful, influential countries in the world. Certainly, both countries are the two most influential countries in the Middle East, and it will take both. But I think we need a lot more responsible behaviour from the Americans. Yesterday, John Kerry, who was in Saudi Arabia, said that his country would keep on supporting, quote, the moderate groups of the Free Syrian Army. Well, number one, who are these moderates? If you think shelling innocent civilians in Damascus or Homs on a daily basis is moderate, then I beg to differ. But also supporting an elite, an armed group within an independent, sovereign country is completely illegal. It's against international law. It's against the mechanisms of the United Nations. By that logic of what John Kerry said yesterday, perhaps this wouldn't happen, but theoretically, Syria should start supporting, quote, moderate anti-federalist groups in the United States. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous that in the 21st century we have countries arming groups within an independent sovereign country. What's the point of having international law? What's the point of having established the United Nations after the Second World War if we're going to have this reckless, dangerous behaviour from certain countries in the world?
So we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. He's publisher and editor of Politics First. He joined me there live from London, UK.